Welcome to Job chapter 40 and 41. Short, rough and ready videos to help you to read the book of Job for yourself and to understand its message. We're preaching through it, but because we're not taking forever to do that, we're going to be preaching some big chunks. And so this is the way we're getting into some of the detail, some of the chapter by chapter, in some ways verse by verse. It can't be verse by verse in detail, but hopefully it gives us enough to really help us to read and pay attention to the detail as well as see the big picture. So this is Job receiving God's second and last message to him. God has spoken to Job out of the whirlwind a first time in chapters 38 to 40, and now for a second time, verse 6, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. So the first time, God is answering the charge that he doesn't have the wisdom or maybe the power to rule this world. He's doing a bad job of ruling. His counsel isn't very good, and he's answered that. And now, verse 8, he's answering questions about his justice, about whether he is in fact some kind of a monster. In various ways Job has said that. He said, when a pestilence comes, the righteous and the unrighteous perish. He's called God a watcher of men. All kinds of ways through the chapters of Job's speech that he, in different ways, comes very, very close to saying, God, you're a monster. He feels that God's arrows are piercing him. All that he's experienced, the horrific things that have happened to his family, to his business, to himself in his health, he feels that God is just tearing him apart like a predator. So the accusation is against God's justice, that God has done wrong in how he's treated Job. So how does God answer this? And we might expect something like the first speech, which is going through in a kind of logical way to explain this. But there is logic, but there's more. There's overwhelming challenge and speaking to Job's mind, but to his gut and to in a deep way to Job's heart, and therefore to us as well as we consider this broken, evil, chaotic world around us, as we think about the things in our lives which we have deep questions about and maybe deep pain that's come to us. So first of all, in verses 9 to 14, in a sense, God challenges Job, to have a go himself at ruling. So, have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? No, this sounds a bit like the previous chapter, how those questions come again and again. But then it changes. Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendour. So it's a real invitation to come on and take on the robes of government, and to take. Okay, God says, I'll step down and you take my place, and let's see what you can do. So it is like that film Bruce Almighty, when Bruce Nolan is complaining to God about how rubbish his life is and how bad things are going. And although it's a terrible film in one way in terms of how it represents God, yet it's quite like Job in that sense that God in Bruce Almighty, Bruce becomes Almighty. He's kind of given the role of God and gets to experience just what a difficult job it is. Even if you have power to part the tomato soup, that memorable scene in the cafe, or whatever it is, you do the job. Pour out the overflowing of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Verse 11. That's the key thing. You bring the proud down low and deal with the wicked. If you can. Verse 14. If you can, then, okay, you have the job, kind of thing. Now, it's not that God's throwing his hands up in the air like we sometimes do if we're criticised and we say, well, you don't know how hard it is. Okay, you try and do it. It's not God having a hissy fit and a bit of a strop at Job. Like, I'm doing my best here, but it's a hard job, and cut me some slack. no, God's not saying that. But he's challenging Job and drawing him into what he's about to say. Look, you can't humble the proud. You can't deal with the proud, the wicked, the dictators, the evil men and women, the injustices that there are that go on in the world. And there are so many, aren't there? Whether it's things done to an individual, the murders, the abuse, the rape, or whether it's at a national level, the bigger thing, the genocides, the unjust wars, the man-made famines through greed, the pollution, whatever it is. You can't deal with all of that. But look what I can deal with. And then it's 15 to 24 description of Behemoth, this creature we get introduced to, and 41 verse 1 to 34, Leviathan, two amazing creatures. And just in outline, the point is that here are two amazing, massive, powerful beasts, and you can't tame them, but I can, and that's going to build and fit with this argument. But let's just hold that and just look at them both. So Behemoth in 15 to 24 is a super beast, a really mighty beast with a ferocious appetite. In verse 15, Behemoth is actually a plural, it's a singular creature, but has a plural, and in Hebrew that can be a plural of majesty. There's something so wonderful about this beast that you refer to it in like the royal we, I guess. This beast is so majestic, so mighty. There's a plurality there. Ferocious appetite, huge strength. Verse 16. Verse 17 could actually be euphemistic and about virility. Let the reader understand on that, about a stiff tail and just a huge frame. And verse 19 to 24 spell out just more about his environment, and he's a sort of land animal, but also happy in the water. But verse 24, the point is he's untamable. Can one take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? No way, you wouldn't do that. But verse 19, he is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. In other words, his maker has dominion over him. His maker will bring him to account, can bring the sword against him. So this is someone who's a creature who's made. Also comes in verse 15, doesn't it? Which I made as I made you, but also managed by God. So God's making the point that he's in charge of this super beast, Behemoth. And then what about Leviathan? Well, Job's already mentioned Leviathan in verse chapter 3, verse 8. And here is just even more of a super beast. This is a water beast, a sea dragon serpent we get described. And it's so lovely, and in some ways there's quite a lot of dark humour in this passage. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Simeon's just brought a fishing rod, and we've been just starting to go and try and learn how to cast and go down into the canals. But imagine, we were there with our fishing rod, trying to catch the megalodon, and we've got our little hook, and there's this colossal shark that's bigger than the biggest blue whale ever, with vicious teeth and whatever. That's right. Yeah, you just go with your little fishing rod and try and catch him. Can you do that? No. Obviously not. Can you kind of tie him up and subdue him and make him say, "Oh no, please, mercy, mercy"? No, of course you can't do that. The idea is ridiculous. This is a monster. It's like those, in Jurassic Park, those big creatures that, only with huge, big containers can they even begin to be contained. And even as the plots develop in those films, that kind of proves to be the problem. They can't be contained. Verse 5, will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your girls? You go out and get hold of Leviathan and bring this lovely little dragon home for your little girl. It's her birthday. It's her 5th birthday. Look, darling, look what I've brought for you. A colossal dragon. I don't know if you've seen the Hobbit. Smaug. Let's call him Smaug. Whoosh, as your house and the children are just burnt up and consumed and devoured. No, obviously you wouldn't do that. That's the kind of the dark humour that there is in this passage. Verse 6, will you go down to the fish market and think, oh, I'm going to have a nice bit of trout? No, I'm not going to have trout this week. I'm going to have a bit of Leviathan. Oh, look there. 400 metres of Leviathan laid out for me. No, obviously not. Not on the Morrisons. That lovely display at the front of Morrisons with the fish. Oh, look, they've got Leviathan this week. Obviously not. Verse 7 to 9. Can you fight him and win? No. This is Lord of the Rings with the Balrog. No one can stand against this monster. And this is heading towards verse 10. Very surprising. So no one is so fierce that he dares stir him up, Leviathan. Who then is he who can stand before me? The point is, here is Leviathan who's so scary, and yet I am scarier. If you can't stand up against Leviathan, who can stand before me? I am greater than Leviathan. Who has first given to me that I should repay him? Who is under the whole, whatever is under the whole heaven is mine, including Leviathan. So, what does that mean for you, Job? What does that mean for Leviathan? What does that mean for all creatures? That we're all accountable to God. We're all under his sway and his rule. And we all depend on him, and he will dispose of us and work things out according to his plans. And then we go back to the description of Leviathan, verse 12 to 14. It's really strong. 13 really untamable. Verse 14 really scary. Verse 15 to 17 just invincible. Really deadly. Verse 18 to 21. And verse 24 is interesting. It might mean really tough sort of breastplate, but maybe it is actually malicious. Having a hard heart. His heart is as hard as stone. What happens if you try and take him on? Verse 25 to 29, as a human being, absolute disaster. And verse 30 to 32, this Leviathan is at home, in the home of evil, of danger, of chaos, of hostility to God, of death. He's at home in the sea. And verse 33 to 34, this beast is unique. On earth there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. He's the king of beasts, the greatest. So what are we to make of these two, and why does God bring these up in his argument? Some people have said these are two creatures, the hippo and the crocodile, and you can certainly see, bits of hippo and bits of crocodile in them, but there are other bits that are harder to see, aren't there? The fire-breathing aspect. But how does that kind of fit with this argument? Because in a way, in chapter 39, God's already gone through the wild creatures and talked about them. So why does this add to the argument? Yes, maybe hippos and crocodiles are a bit bigger and scarier maybe than horses, but not necessarily, I guess. And so a bit of I'm not sure that really merits this being such the climax of the book. So I don't personally go with that. I'm a bit more sympathetic to people who say that it's even bigger than that, to different kinds of dinosaur, and I believe that God made dinosaurs. Dinosaurs lived at the same time as mankind. If you want more on that, go to Answers in Genesis. They've got lots of stuff about dinosaurs. So I'm not. I don't think it's impossible that this could be. Job knew about dinosaurs, and that either he was living with them, or they were within living memory of Job. That could be the case. But again, although that's sort of more understandable than a hippo or a crocodile, it doesn't quite answer the whole problem of evil. Just that God is bigger than a dinosaur. So I think there's still more. I think the fact that sea dragons and monsters were part of the mythology of the ancient Near East as being forces opposed to the gods gets us closer to the mark. And the Bible's not ashamed and embarrassed to kind of draw on other cultures and take some of those cultures, partly to critique it and partly to kind of show how unique God is and how much greater he is. So the point isn't that God's in some equal battle with these great monsters like in other ancient religions. But there is a grain of truth in those ancient religions, and here is God, and he's utterly more powerful than these beasts. But we get the answer in the Bible. I think we don't have to go outside the Bible to find this out. So Isaiah 27. In that day, the Lord, with his hard and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So there's a reference to this sea dragon, this serpent, who God will slay, and we see that in Psalm 74 as well. Yet God, my King, is of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. And in that situation, it seems to be a reference to the enemies of God and the forces that oppose God's people. And we come to the New Testament and to the book of Revelation, to chapter 12, with this idea of sea dragons, of serpents in our minds. 12:9. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. Here's the point. This Leviathan represents Satan, the ultimate force for evil, the ultimate enemy of God and of his people, the ultimate deliverer of chaos and destruction, the deceiver of the whole world. So that's who this Leviathan is. Chapter Revelation 20 verse 2. And he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. So that's what we're dealing with here. That's why it's an appropriate climax for this book, that here is Job being told about God's control over Leviathan, because that's the point. So, Job 41 verse 5, you're not going to put Leviathan on a leash and bring him home as a pet, but I have Satan on a leash. And that's really helpful to the book, because remember, at the beginning of the book we see how Satan reports to God and can only do what God allows him to do. He suggests things and God gives him permission, but he cannot go beyond that permission. You may harm his things and his family, but not him. You may harm his body, but not take his life. See, Satan is on a leash. But we might think that Satan's quite nice. I mean, well, not nice exactly, but we don't have a full picture of Satan at the beginning of the book. Whereas here, we get to see in kind of another way, like the fog has lifted and we see more clearly. This Satan is an awful, malicious, powerful, no one can stand against him beast. Well, that's what Job has experienced in his life. But here we're seeing Satan kind of unmasked. We've seen his handiwork, which is awful, but now we're seeing the actual beast himself, and he's awful, and yet God has him on that leash. Do you see how the beginning and the end of the book are matching up and are making sense? And so here the mystery of evil is God's mystery. We don't know why there's this creature, but we see that this creature is under God's control. And if you say it's God's mystery, God's Satan. So God is to be feared more than this beast. He is the one that we're to truly tremble before, rather than this king of beasts. Satan, we're told, he is the ruler of the kingdom of the air, but God is greater. I think it's really striking in the New Testament in Mark 4 and 5. And do have a read of those chapters, because there we get to see Jesus' authority over a storm, over death and disease. We've been seeing those things, and demons, even an army of demons in the demon-possessed man, and send them out into the pigs. But in the storm and after that casting out of the demons, the reaction of the disciples and the reaction of the people in the region is terror. They are fearful of Jesus, and there's a sense in which that fear is right. That sense that Jesus is greater than the evil one, and with just a word he can cast out those demons. They have to ask permission for anything they do, because that's how much greater God is than the evil one. And yet, it's not that we just totally that's a terrible thing. To fear God is good, because when we fear him, we've got nothing else to fear, because those demons will go, because we can trust God with evil. I think that's the message of this part of Job. That's the sense, and we might think therefore that Jesus is going to come as some kind of sword-wielding colossus to slay the dragon. But the reality is, Hebrews 2 verse 14, it's through his death that Jesus comes to defeat Satan, the one who in John 12:31 is called the ruler of this world. Or in Ephesians, we get told that he's the prince of the power of the air. But the thing we get told in Ephesians is that rather than just being our enemy, he's actually our king, because in our sin, we've joined up with Leviathan. So there's a deep problem in the world. Not just there's evil out there, but there's evil in here. So you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. But God acted, and God has saved us, and we see it's all through Jesus, and we know that that's through Jesus' death and resurrection. And in Colossians, let me just find Colossians chapter 2 verse 13 to 15. And you who are dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us our trespasses by cancelling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. It was through Jesus' weakness and his death the serpent struck him and seemed to have destroyed him, and yet 3 days later he rose again. That is how God brings an end, ultimately holds a sword to Leviathan, to Behemoth, and it seems maybe the Behemoth represents death. So we've got death and Satan, great enemies of God and of his people and of his purposes, but God is in charge of them. So, wow, what a chapter. We're going to see what Job's response is next time. I hope that helps us get into some of the imagery, see what's going on, and help us to understand why these chapters come as a real strong answer to Job's criticism of God, that he is unjust. No, God is completely in charge and over evil. Evil is on a leash. Yes, this world is brutally scary, and there's sometimes wild things that go on, and if we experience them, it can feel like we are being savaged by a wild beast. But just like in a house where there's a big vicious dog comes charging at us, there's also a chain the owner has put on it, and the dog can go no further. That doesn't mean that we won't experience great pain. Job did. But Job's fear is that there's no end to this, that this savaging is going to go on forever, and he thinks it's from God himself. But what this passage tells us is, no, it's not from God himself. God is righteous and does not do evil. And he has evil on a leash. So this won't go on beyond what God's plans and purposes. God is utterly in charge of evil.